This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello you! This is Inside Science from BBC Radio 4. First broadcast on the 31st of January. No, it wasn't. That was last week. On the 7th of February 2019, I'm Adam Rutherford. The history of Spain today, as told with DNA. We cover 1,000 years of invasion, conquest, re-invasion and reconquest, all mapped out by an incredibly detailed look at the genes of living Spaniards. We have an electricity-generating brick, one that makes use of the fact that it's colder inside than out, and could be a way of generating power in refugee camps. And with all the horse races in the UK cancelled today because of an outbreak of equine flu, we take a look at the virus, the horses, and how to contain the infection. But first, humankind's impact on the Antarctic is something we monitor and model very closely, not least because the frozen south is a good metric by which we can assess the change in global climate, but also because a warming planet has more obvious and significant effects down there. No models predict that there won't be a sea level rise as the climate changes, but the amount by which the sea will rise as the ice melts is something that is hard to pin down. After all, these are statistical predictions, albeit based on millions of bits of data, and there's more than one way to skin a cat. One of the significant factors in the higher end of sea level rise predictions has been the impact of collapsing ice shelves and ice cliff instability, notably in a big study from 2016, which put the potential contribution of the warming Antarctic to more than a metre, prompting headlines warning of an ice apocalypse. But in a couple of new big studies out this week, researchers crunched the data even harder and worked out that ice cliff collapse is less important than in previous models and has fuelled an overestimate of sea level rise. I asked lead scientist Tamsin Edwards how much lower their sea level rises are now compared to the earlier predictions.
It's important to know and remember that the 2016 study by Rob de Conto and Dave Pollard was a first go at predicting what would happen under this new hypothesis of marine ice cliff instability. What we've done is dig into their data in more detail, their model simulations, the way that they tested their model, and worked out how robust the evidence is. And we found that the cliff instability is not needed to explain the past, so therefore that would reduce the predictions of sea level contribution in the future.
That original study, which was 2016, people were talking about it as like the ice apocalypse, and that as a result of the huge volume of ice that was collapsing off cliffs, sea level rise would be significantly higher than previous models had suggested. And what you've done is to have another look at it, and you don't think that those collapses are going to happen, or that it will be less significant?
Well, it was a hugely influential paper because the predictions were greater than 1 metre for the Antarctic contribution. Now, there are kind of two angles to this, and one uncontroversial part of it is that cliffs could collapse if they're too tall. You know, they're mechanically unstable if they're too tall. What isn't clear is the way that might translate into a positive feedback. Now, we haven't ruled out this feedback as a possibility, but what we've said is that the way that they represented it in their model, which is quite a simplified way, the data, when you compare it with, for example, sea level change of the last of 3 million years ago, of the last interglacial and the last 25 years of satellite records, that their cliff collapse mechanism isn't needed to reproduce the kind of high sea levels we've seen in the past. And so that means we're not running new numerical models here. It's purely statistics. We're just digging into their data in more detail. But it just means that our balance of probability is very much towards the lower end of their predictions.
And you're not in any way suggesting that there is going to be no sea level rise as a result of your modified modelling, your statistical modelling of this original data. It's just significantly less. What are the sort of numbers we're talking about?
Well, we present two alternative scenarios because we can't rule this feedback in or out, if you like. If you include their hypothesis of this feedback, we get a most likely value of 45 centimetres of sea level contribution from Antarctica this century. Now, that's less than half some of their highest numbers that they predicted. But if you exclude the feedback, and we think we can, given that there's not strong evidence for it in the way that it's in their model, then the most likely value goes down to 15 centimetres. But the contribution is still substantial, and it's still actually bigger than the last assessment report from the IPCC. So not anywhere near as much higher as the de Conto and Pollard study, but still higher and still, of course, really important.
Real ongoing issue, this, because what we're talking about and what we primarily talk about on this programme is the process of science. Data gets changed as more information becomes available and as analyses change. And so you're commenting on an earlier study here. But policy is a different matter because governments get locked in timescales where they can't just, follow every single paper that's published on a week-to-week basis. So how do you build that into how the IPCC advises government?
Well, it's interesting. I think we have moved to a much more iterative and changing approach to policy these days anyway. We have these kind of ratchet mechanisms where the countries update their plans and their pledges every 5 years to some extent and on longer timescales as well. So it's not like people just make decisions and then stick to them forever. It's very much informed by the changing evidence assessed by the IPCC. I think what's really interesting about the ICE climate paper is that it shows that science can be quite influenced by the history of that science. And I think historically, the global climate modellers were a separate community from the ice sheet modellers for Greenland and Antarctica. And so obviously there are ice sheets represented in global climate models, but just in a more simplified way. And the state-of-the-art ice sheet models are being done by a separate community. And what we're seeing in the last few years is much, much more coupling and linking of those together so that you get the best of both worlds and you get those interactions between the ice sheets, the atmosphere and the ocean, and we can get really the full picture.
Within science, of course, that is exactly what we do. We keep working on the same things over and refining, and we continue to make more accurate predictions and modelling of reality. Now, outside of science, and particularly, you spend a lot of time engaging with people who are antagonistic towards climate science. Do you find that the process of science bolsters them, emboldens them, and says, well, you can't decide from one day to another whether it's going to be 15 centimetres or a metre?
I think you get some people who will say, well, make your mind up, or these people say that, you say they're wrong. But I think, I'm a passionate believer in talking a lot about the process of science and the refining and the pendulum swinging of the results and the new findings being exciting. If we knew all the answers, it wouldn't be science, right? It wouldn't be research. But I think that there are more thoughtful skeptics out there as well who are scientists themselves, possibly, who are familiar with scientific methods. And, we can get some pretty useful scrutiny from them as well. We've had examples of climate skeptics picking up on errors in papers in the past. So, it's basically a spectrum. And I understand why we have skeptics who are grumpy about science. Everyone's grumpy about something. But there are plenty of good skeptics out there who are questioning the science in good ways as well.
So it's all part of the process.
Yeah, you can't generalise, I think. You get a lot of different viewpoints out there. But I definitely think that it's not necessarily a school thing. I think there are plenty of very, very good school teachers who are really teaching what science research is, that it's not a neat piling of fact upon fact, that it's sometimes a messy, contested process, that there's lots of uncertainties. But somehow there's a kind of a cultural myth that science, every bit of science is immediately certain and immediately agrees. But when you're at the cutting edge of science, you always get one person has a go at it, someone else has a go and gets a different answer, someone else, and we argue about it and we refine things and we convince each other and we get more evidence, more data, more modelling. We try things in different ways to get the same answer or more closely converging answers. And I think it's so important to talk about that somewhat messy process to say that's how we eventually get to an answer.
Tamsin Edwards from King's College London. Let us know what you think. BBC Inside Science at bbc.co.uk. Now, news in today is that all the race meetings have been cancelled across the UK as 3 horses have been diagnosed with equine flu. More worrying, as far as we know at this early stage, is that all the horses were already vaccinated. The British Horse Racing Authority have acted swiftly to try and contain the infections. Janet Daly is an expert on equine flu. She's on the line right now. Janet, thank you for joining us. Let's get into the nuts and bolts of equine flu. What are the symptoms? How lethal is it?
So equine flu is really very much the same as influenza in people. It involves a temperature and a nasty cough, a runny nose, and makes the horses feel pretty sick. And just like in people, it's not normally fatal, but it can be in foals, for example, and in very rare cases.
And in terms of transmission, that's the thing that we're really concerned with and why the races have been shut down. How infectious is it? How does transmission occur?
It's a very infectious virus. Transmission mainly is by one horse coughing and the virus passing through the air to another horse. But you can also get transmission from basically the horse having coughed onto a piece of equipment and that being moved over to another horse as well.
So it does require sort of direct-ish contact?
Direct-ish, although there is evidence that with the right wind direction, the virus can travel up to even as far as a mile.
So the actions of the British Horse Racing Authority, that is the sensible thing to do to stop the flu spreading to, well, becoming an epidemic.
Absolutely. The last major epidemic that there was in the UK during 2003 affected around 21 racing yards in Newmarket and continued on for about 9 weeks. So the actions they've taken today hopefully can nip that in the bud and prevent the spreading of the virus to other centres around the country and keep it out of Newmarket.
And just to be sure, just to reassure our listeners, it's not transmissible to humans, is it?
It isn't, no. We have different receptors in our respiratory tract to those that the horses have. And although in the past people did make attempts to experimentally infect people with the horse virus, it doesn't really transmit to people.
And where is the origin of this particular outbreak? Is there a reservoir of equine flu that is just, sort of waiting to be transmitted to horses? It
will have been circulating in horses in the intervening period since the last big outbreak. Basically, those horses that are protected by vaccination, you don't see it until the vaccine breaks down due to a high pressure of virus that's evolved. In between times, it tends to be circulating in unvaccinated horses in different parts of the country and the world.
And that's a key point of interest for this particular report, isn't it? That the 3 horses, as far as we know so far, the 3 horses that are infected have already been vaccinated.
Yes, that's right. And there have been, over the past couple of weeks, reports of vaccinated horses being infected in France as well. So clearly the vaccines aren't offering full protection against the currently circulating strain.
So how does that work? Is it like human vaccination for flu, that we have to do it every year?
So just like the human flu vaccines, the strain composition of the equine vaccine is reviewed every year. However, it isn't changed as frequently. The virus doesn't evolve as quickly in horses.
So the vaccination that these horses and that it is standard at the moment, is that based on, is it based on the 2007 outbreak?
The vaccine's recommendation that's made every year includes one strain that's from 2007 and then another strain that's a bit of a variant of that dates back to 2003, 2004 and the last major outbreak we had then.
So it's quite possible that this vaccine is not effective against the current evolved strains of equine flu? That's
quite likely. So the virus has evolved over the past 10, 15 years and accumulated differences that mean that a horse that's raised antibodies to the vaccine strain, those antibodies are no longer able to recognise the circulating virus.
So if the vaccine is possibly ineffective and is out of date, well, how should we go about getting an up-to-date vaccine which is going to prevent these types of outbreaks?
So there'll be an annual meeting of an expert panel to recommend an update to the vaccine strain, and then it's incumbent on the vaccine manufacturers to generate stocks of that vaccine, produce new vaccine and confirm the safety and efficacy of that vaccine. So it's quite a long and costly process.
OK, thanks, Janet. That was Janet Daly from the University of Nottingham. Now, renewable technologies mean that we can harness electricity from the wind, from waves and from the sun. But what about using the temperature difference between the inside of your house and the outside? New research by chemists at King's College London is doing just that by creating a brick that can generate electricity utilising the temperature differential between the inside and the outside. It is in its early stages, but they hope it will increase access to electricity in temporary accommodation, such as in refugee camps. BBC Inside Science's Hannah Fisher went along to see the prototype in the lab and to speak to Lee Aldous, who is running the project.
This is a Perspex box, relatively thin walls here, and then within this hollow cavity we're able to insert 2 electrodes. And these are just graphite, exactly the same as what we use in pencil. So it's highly conductive and very cheap. And then we just have these either side. And within the gap in between them, we're able to fill it with our gelled electrolyte, which is electrochemically active. if we imagine building a wall such that we have the large faces facing one side inside, the other side outside, as long as we have a temperature difference between inside and outside, we then have a temperature difference across our brick, across our two electrodes, and then therefore we're going to be generating electricity as a consequence.
That sounds simple enough, right? But getting the right electrolyte, a salt that can conduct electricity, has proved tricky. They've tried a few already, and now the team are attempting to make the safe, cheap, abundant salt, iron sulfate, work for the electric brick.
We ended up using compounds known as ferricyanide, but we take their soluble form and we dissolve them, and we will end up having an iron salt where half of it is in one...
In a nutshell, if you subject a special salt to high temperatures, an electron is forced off one of the salts, leaving it free to move from one electrode to the other. This creates a current. And if you then go on to embed the salt in a gel polymer, you can really ramp up the reaction rates. One candidate Lee is looking at might come as a bit of a surprise. It's sodium polyacrylate, which you may know as the soil wetting gel you can put in plant pots. Or, if you Google it, it's the latest kids' craze, Magic Snow.
What I have here is very fine white powder, just ground up sodium polyacrylate, our super absorbent polymer, which is widely employed in all kinds of absorbent media, for example nappies. And I have 5 grams of this polymer here, and I have around about 500 millilitres of water. And then as I add this water to the polymer, what will happen now is it starts to expand, and you can see that it's gelled already. And now I can start to tip, and hopefully, yes, I can invert the beaker. And the water has now been immobilised. And this is how we make our gelled electrolytes in a matter of seconds.
It looks like almost a crystal, and so you're touching it. And
it's not toxic at all.
Can I touch it?
Yep, go ahead.
Oh, that's really weird.
It's like the stuff you put in the bottom of plant pots to soak up excess water.
It's like jelly that looks like snow, that's also squishy and a bit wet. But it's really cool, and that's the inside of the brick.
Yes.
Oh, I've got snow everywhere, sorry.
Yeah, it sticks to everything.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Yeah. One of Lee's undergraduate students, Connor Beale, spent all of last summer trying to get the brick to produce a spark.
So my main focus was to look at the prototype brick that we made, and we knew that in principle we were able to generate electricity, but we didn't know whether in reality you would actually be able to produce electricity from it. So we were testing different concentrations of the electrolyte in the solution, putting that into the brick, and seeing if we could get current from it with different temperature differences, looking at different environments to see the most realistic environment that we could come up with.
And what were those different realistic environment and temperature differences?
We've got some polystyrene boxes up here. We put the heat inside the polystyrene box, so that would heat the inside, and then the outside would be kept at a cool temperature.
Where did the brick go in relation to that then? Was the brick in the polystyrene box?
Yeah,
or?
so the brick would be in this hole in the wall, and it would just slot into the wall, and you'd have the 2 large faces with the electrodes on either side, which would be connected up to see if we could generate electricity from that.
I see, so you kind of got a little model house.
Like a baby house with just 1 brick in it is what we made.
And they did get electricity generated using their prototype brick. Although Lee admits it was very low power, it is still early days.
In terms of how much we've generated and it can generate, our initial prototypes, which we assembled very quickly and very cheaply, just generated a few dozen microwatts, which is simply not enough to be viable. Our targeted goal is to try to get each brick producing 10 milliwatts. If we can reach that kind of goal, then the wall composed of these bricks, covering the size of perhaps 2 normal doorways, that should power more than enough electricity to power 1 USB port. And then from that USB port, you can imagine you can run a fan, you can charge a mobile phone, you can light up LED lighting and so on.
Okay, 250 special bricks might sound a lot to power 1 USB port, but as Lee explains, they provide an everlasting energy supply, and they're not really designing them for regular households in the UK.
Initially, we are targeting, for example, refugee camps, which could be in a hot nation, and perhaps after there's been a migration of people, or conversely, there's been a natural disaster. And we envisage the bricks are brought in devoid of water, and then the water is applied on site. We're yet to determine if we can get away with using river water, but the hope is, for example, that we could. And then we're designing our bricks to actually be magnetically assemblable. So the idea is they just magnetically click together, and then that is how we also provide the electrical connection from brick to brick to brick. And then this will then result in a very rapid, hopefully sturdy, temporary shelter, which could also provide enough electricity for people to have nighttime lighting and ideally recharge their phone.
Lee Aldous ending that report by Hannah Fisher. Finally this week, a few years ago, we featured an amazing project called The People of the British Isles, in which samples of DNA from British people were taken and using amazingly fine-scale analysis were plotted on a map of the country to see if we could see clusters of similar genes. The results were stunning, detailed patterns that recapitulated Britain's history of migration and invasion and told us fascinating details about our past, such as, despite several hundred years of Danelaw, the Danish Vikings left little trace of DNA in contemporary Brits, and this suggests that they were top-down rulers and didn't really integrate with the locals. Well, the same technique has now been applied to Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, and the results are equally enlightening and stunning. A set of fairly neat vertical stripes of similarity run from north to south, indicating that at this very fine resolution, Spanish people are genetically more similar in these vertical columns, but more different as you go east to west. How does this fit in with what we know about Spanish history? Claire Bycroft is the geneticist and now de facto historian in charge, and I started by asking her how they collected the data.
We started off with about 1,500 Spanish people, and we do a bit of quality control, which means we have to make sure that the data makes sense. And after we've done that, we had about 1,400 Spaniards to work with. And what you'll see on the maps in our paper is actually a subset of those. Although we used everybody in the statistical inference, we had data about the locations for only a subset of those, so that's what you see on the maps.
So we're going to put the maps up on the website so people
great.
can have a look at them, because they are just... well, they're stunning. And the first time I looked at it, I thought, well, the pattern there is just unbelievably clear and really surprising, because there are these almost like vertical stripes running down Spain. So why do we see such clear north-south similarity and difference east to west?
We think this has to do with historical events that happened around the time of 1100 to around 1400 in Spain. Historians have looked at this, and there is evidence that quite substantial numbers of people moved from the northern parts of Spain to southern parts of Spain during the time when Christian kings in the north were fighting with Muslim rulers in the south, and slowly but surely they regained territory, and as they did that, they encouraged the northern populations to move south. So we think that what we're seeing in the genetics reflects this historical population movement.
So this is the idea of the Reconquista.
That's right.
So the Christians slowly migrating down south as they're fighting Muslim rulers until they reach the bottom. But still, that doesn't necessarily explain why you see these stripes. You see, yes, you can see the migration from the north to the south, but why are they still delineated? Why don't people spread east to west?
In terms of the demographic forces, that's a mystery. We have the genetics to say that it seems like people moved in the north-south direction predominantly. One theory might be that we see that there's structure in the north, so there are genetic differences in the north parts of Spain that we think probably are a bit older than the structure we see further to the south. So it might be that the genetic differences that existed previously in the north were just translated to the south. And actually an example of that we see directly in our data is the Basque population. In the Basque country, we see that they have distinct genetic signatures, and we see those signatures directly to the south of the Basque country more clearly than to the east and to the west. So we think that this is clear evidence that people certainly moved in the north-south direction more than the east and the west. Why they did that? Maybe it was that the political leaders, the kings, didn't want to encroach on the territory of their neighbours, who ostensibly I think were probably not their enemies, but they probably wanted to keep the peace with them. That's one theory.
But it's sensible speculation, but we don't quite know why those stripes are so prominent.
No.
And it's worth pointing out that the differences that you're seeing are really, really fine scale, incredibly sort of wispy differences between people that are only detectable using some pretty intense stats.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, you do see little pockets of difference, like Galicia seems to look very different from the rest of Spain.
Yeah.
Why is that?
We think that's a result of something called genetic drift, which occurs when populations tend not to mix with surrounding populations. And this encourages or increases the genetic differences between people and those isolated groups and groups outside. And so we think that from looking at some of the demographics of Galicia, that this might not be quite so surprising in the region. We know that lots of people there live in small towns and villages, and this has been true for a long time. So we think that the effects of drift are probably exaggerated in the Galician region.
And Galicia sits at the top of, well, it's the northwest of Spain, and it sits right above Portugal. So do you see that stripe continue down into Portugal? Are the Galicians more similar to the Portuguese than they are to other parts of Spain?
In fact, we did that analysis, and indeed that is the case. So the Galicians look much more like the Portuguese genetically than they do, indeed, to their neighbours to the east.
Now, of course, all countries are the same and all countries are different in that they're all invaded and there's migration in all sorts of directions, but the geography of each country, ends up specifying the types of delineation of people that you're seeing in this paper. One of the interesting things about Spain is that you've got several hundred years worth of Muslim rule, which has come across from Africa. So do you see African DNA throughout the Spanish population?
Absolutely. We didn't specifically go out to look for it. And in fact, the algorithms that we used to find these patterns involved data from all around Europe and lots of parts of North Africa. We gave the data to the algorithm, and the algorithm said to us there is quite a lot of ancestry from North Africa in Spain. Not only that, but it varies quite a lot across Spain. It tends to be almost negligible in the Basque regions and quite low, around 1% in the northeast, like in the Catalan region. And then highest, actually, quite surprisingly, on the western parts of Spain, in Galicia, indeed, and in Portugal. And what we were able to also do was to actually date the timing of this mixing. And we know that there was a major political event in 711 when the Muslim conquest occurred. And we know that after that, there was some migration from North Africa. But what we've been able to show is that actually the impact of that genetically started to occur probably about 100 years after the initial invasion.
So the genetics that you see in these sort of broad stripes running from north to south, is that reflected in the culture or particularly in the languages of Spain as well?
Quite strongly, actually. If you look at the maps of linguistic patterns that were known to exist in the 14th century in Iberia, and you compare that to our map of genetic clusters, then it doesn't take a genius to know that there is some kind of correspondence. They look very similar. And this is not just a visual trick. We did some robust statistical analysis to check that this correspondence was significant, and indeed it is. It's even significant after you account for the fact that people who are